Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to get into some econ today?
Always ready to geek out over some economics. Let's do it.
Awesome. So we're tackling a pretty influential book today, Hernando de Soto's The Mystery of Capital.
Yeah, this one's a classic. It's gotten a lot of buzz over the years, and for good reason.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got folks like Thomas Friedman, Bill Bradley, and even Thomas Sowell all singing its praises, it's got to have some serious weight behind it.
Definitely. So what exactly is this mysterious capital De Soto's talking about?
Well, the book dives into this really intriguing question of why capitalism seems to thrive in some parts of the world, but struggles in others.
Right, and De Soto's main argument is that it all boils down to property rights.
Property rights. Okay, so how does that work?
He says it's not about a lack of entrepreneurial spirit or resources in developing countries.
Mm.
You see bustling markets and people working hard all over the world.
Yeah, that's true. I've seen it myself. But then what's stopping them from achieving the same kind of prosperity we see in more developed economies?
Well, De Soto argues that without clear, secure property rights, all that hard work and ingenuity gets stifled. It's like a car with no wheels.
Mm-hmm.
You can have all the horsepower in the world, but you're not going anywhere.
So it's like they're playing the game with one hand tied behind their backs.
Exactly. And, we often hear this narrative that capitalism is already global. I mean, you can get a Big Mac pretty much anywhere these days, right?
Yeah, true. But I guess DeSoto's saying that's just scratching the surface.
Right, that's the facade.
Yeah.
He argues that real deep-rooted capitalism needs a solid foundation. And that foundation is secure property rights. When those are missing, you get instability, turmoil, and even this rise in anti-capitalist sentiment we're seeing around the world.
That's a scary thought. So are people starting to lose faith in the whole system?
It's definitely a trend worth paying attention to. Even in Latin America, support for privatization has dropped from 46% to 36% recently.
So even though we see these outward signs of capitalism spreading, it's not necessarily translating to genuine economic progress for everyone.
Exactly. And that's where De Soto's work comes in. He spent years traveling the world, really digging deep into these issues, and what he found was pretty mind-blowing.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What did he uncover?
Well, he and his team stumbled upon this massive amount of what he calls dead capital.
Dead capital. What's
Yeah,
that?
think of it like this. It's all these assets that people have, things like homes, businesses, even land, but they can't leverage them for economic growth because they lack formal legal recognition.
So it's like having a treasure chest, but no key to open it.
Exactly. You might have a thriving family business, but without a proper title for your land, you can't get a loan to expand or use it as collateral. All that value is essentially trapped.
That's incredibly frustrating. You're telling me there's all this potential just sitting there untapped.
And on a massive scale, De Soto's team surveyed 5 cities around the world. And based on their data, they estimated that the total value of this dead capital held by the poor in developing and former communist countries is at least $9.3 trillion.
Wait, $9.3 trillion? That's insane. How much is that exactly?
Well, to put it into perspective, that's twice the entire U.S. money supply. It's practically equal to the value of all the companies listed on the world's top 20 stock exchanges. And here's the kicker. It's way bigger than all the foreign aid, World Bank loans, and foreign investment combined over the last several decades.
Wow, that's a truly staggering amount of untapped potential. But how did all this capital end up dead in the first place? What's the root cause?
Well, De Soto links it to this massive migration from rural areas to cities happening in many developing countries. It's a pattern we saw in the West during the Industrial Revolution, and now it's happening on an even grander scale.
Can you give us some numbers to wrap our heads around this?
Sure. Since 1979, over 100 million people in China alone have moved from rural areas to cities. That's like the entire population of some countries.
That's mind-boggling. So these cities are bursting at the seams.
Yeah, and you see similar patterns in places like Port-au-Prince, Haiti cities that are growing at an incredible pace. But here's the problem. The legal systems in many of these countries just haven't kept up.
So the rules of the game haven't caught up with the reality on the ground.
Exactly. They're trying to operate with a system that was designed for a much smaller rural population.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what it's like for someone trying to navigate the bureaucracy to start a legal business or obtain ownership of land.
It's a nightmare.
It is. De Soto found that trying to get legal ownership of land in Haiti takes an average of 19 years.
19 years. Are you serious? You
Yeah.
could build an entire city in that time.
It's no wonder people are finding ways to do things outside the traditional legal framework.
Okay.
They have to. The system is just too cumbersome and inaccessible.
So they're creating their own rules, their own systems.
Exactly. This is what De Soto calls extra legality. People are creating their own sets of rules for conducting business, building homes, getting things done. They're essentially building a parallel economy.
A shadow economy. That sounds kind of risky, though. Isn't it dangerous to operate outside the law?
There were definitely downsides. We'll get into those a bit later. But here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit reassuring. The West, during its transition to capitalism, went through a very similar period of extra legality.
Wait, you're saying that even developed economies have a history of rule bending?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Think about the American frontier. Those settling in the West often had to come up with their own systems for property rights. They didn't have time to wait for the government to catch up.
So it was like the Wild West in more ways than one.
Exactly. You had things like tomahawk rights where people would mark trees to claim land. Or during the California Gold Rush, miners established these claim associations to manage mining claims and settle disputes. It was all pretty informal, but it worked.
So they created their own rule book, essentially.
And eventually, these extra legal systems got integrated into the formal legal framework. So it's not like this is some unprecedented phenomenon.
So if the West managed to pull it off, why is it so difficult for developing countries today?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's not just about technical challenges. We're talking about deeply ingrained political and social structures that can be very resistant to change.
So it's more complicated than just saying, hey, everyone should have property rights.
Way more complicated. And one of the biggest challenges DeSoto identifies is what he calls the mystery of political awareness.
What's that?
Basically, he's saying that governments often misdiagnose the problem. They see poverty, crime, urban sprawl as separate issues, when in reality, they're all symptoms of a legal system that's failing to recognize and integrate this massive extra-legal economy.
So they're missing the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And part of the problem is that in advanced economies, property rights underpin so many other systems, finance, insurance, taxation. It's easy to overlook how crucial they are. It's like the foundation of the whole building.
So it's not just about economics, it's about the whole structure of society.
Exactly. And without that solid foundation, everything else becomes unstable and shaky.
Okay, so we've got this massive amount of dead capital out there and these outdated legal systems struggling to keep up. What's the solution? What does DeSoto propose we do about it?
That brings us to his big idea, the capitalization process. He believes we need to find ways to transform all that dead capital into live capital assets that can be used to generate wealth and drive economic growth.
And how do we do that?
He argues that the key is legal reform. We need to find ways to formally recognize and integrate those existing extra-legal arrangements.
But we've already talked about how tricky legal reform can be. It's not as simple as just waving a magic wand.
Oh, definitely not. It's a complex process with a whole host of challenges. But DeSoto emphasizes the need to understand and incorporate those existing social contracts, the unwritten rules that are already governing how people operate in the extra-legal economy.
So it's not about imposing a top-down solution. It's about working with what's already happening on the ground.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the agency and ingenuity of people who are already creating value, often in incredibly challenging circumstances. They're not waiting for handouts. They're building businesses, creating jobs, finding ways to thrive. What they need is a system that recognizes and supports their efforts.
That's a really powerful idea. It's about empowerment, not just aid.
Exactly. And it's about unlocking the potential that's already there, just waiting to be unleashed.
This is fascinating stuff. We've covered a lot of ground already, but we've only just scratched the surface of DeSoto's ideas.
In the next part, we'll delve deeper into the specific challenges of implementing this capitalization process, the potential benefits, and of course, the inevitable pushback.
Can't wait to unpack it all. Stay tuned. All right, so we've established that unlocking all this dead capital has this incredible potential to really shake things up. But I imagine actually implementing DeSoto's capitalization process isn't exactly a walk in the park, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a huge undertaking with a ton of challenges. For starters, just the sheer scale of this extra-legal world we're talking about. It's not like we can just snap our fingers and everyone suddenly have a formal title to their property or business.
Right, it's not like there's this giant registration booth everyone can just line up at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even if there were, there's a real risk of unintended consequences. Formalizing property rights could lead to things like increased property taxes, which should actually make it harder for some people to hold onto their assets.
So it's this delicate balance. You want to empower people with legal recognition, but not burden them with costs they can't handle.
Precisely. And this is where understanding those existing social contracts we talked about becomes so important. We need to look at how things are actually working on the ground and design systems that complement not disrupt those existing arrangements.
Can you give us an example, like make it real for us?
Sure. Think about the example of extra-legal housing we talked about earlier. You know how in many developing countries, people gradually build their homes stage by stage as they can afford materials.
Right, it's like this incremental process.
Exactly. And it might seem a bit backward to someone who's used to a more formal system.
Yeah, it's kind of like getting dressed by putting on your shoes first, then your socks.
Hmm.
It makes sense in context.
Exactly. Now imagine a formalization process that completely ignores this approach. If you suddenly require people to get building permits and meet all these stringent building codes for every single stage of construction, you're basically shutting them out of the formal system before they even have a chance to participate.
So instead of creating a pathway to legitimacy, you're actually putting up more roadblocks.
Exactly. That's why DeSoto stresses this importance of a gradual step-by-step approach. You got to meet people where they are, not where you think they should be.
It's about building a bridge, not a wall. Makes sense. But even if you can figure out all the technical stuff, what about the political challenges? I mean, surely not everyone's going to be on board with this idea of bringing the extra legal sector into the fold.
You're hitting on a major point here. DeSoto actually identifies three main groups who might resist this kind of reform: the elites, the lawyers, and maybe surprisingly some of the extra legals themselves.
Okay, let's break that down. Starting with the elites. Why would they be opposed to something that on the surface seems like it would benefit everyone?
Well, in a lot of developing countries, the elites often benefit from the fact that a large portion of the population is operating outside the formal economy. They control access to the official channels, the parents, the licenses, the legal protections. Bringing the extra legals into the system could disrupt their power base and create competition they'd rather avoid.
So it's about protecting their own interests, even if it means holding others back?
It's a classic case of vested interests. They have a stake in maintaining the status quo, even if it's not the most efficient or equitable system.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the lawyers? Why would they resist reform? I mean, you'd think they'd be all for upholding the law.
Well, they are, but their training is often focused on upholding the existing legal system, not necessarily on challenging it or making it more inclusive.
Hmm.
And let's be honest, simplifying property rights could potentially reduce the demand for their services.
Right, because if the system's easier to navigate, people wouldn't need as much legal assistance.
Exactly. It's a valid concern from their perspective. And then there's the group that might surprise you, some of the extra legal entrepreneurs themselves.
Why would they be against something that would give them legal recognition and protection?
It seems counterintuitive, but think about it. For some, operating outside the law offers a certain degree of freedom and flexibility. They might be worried that formalizing their businesses would expose them to more reputations, taxes, bureaucratic hurdles.
It's like the old saying, better the devil you know than the devil you don't.
Exactly. They're used to navigating the shadows, and the formal world might seem too risky or restrictive.
So it's not as simple as just assuming everyone wants to be part of the system.
Right. And this is where DeSoto's emphasis on consensus building becomes absolutely crucial. You can't just bulldoze through these reforms. You need to bring all the stakeholders to the table, listen to their concerns, and demonstrate that the benefits outweigh the risks.
So it's about building trust and showing that everyone has a stake in creating a more inclusive and efficient system.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one country or context might not work in another. The key is to tailor the reform process to the specific social, economic, and political realities on the ground.
So being adaptable, being willing to listen and adjust along the way.
Absolutely. And it's about patience. Transforming deeply ingrained systems takes time and persistence. It's not a quick fix. But if it's done right, DeSoto argues it can unleash this wave of economic growth and opportunity.
Because ultimately what DeSoto's talking about isn't just about economics. It's about social justice. It's about creating a system where everyone has a fair shot at success, not just those who happen to be born on the right side of the tracks.
Exactly. It's
Right.
about recognizing that the poor aren't the problem. They're the solution. They have the drive, the ingenuity. And as DeSoto's research shows, they have the assets. What they need is a legal framework that unlocks that potential.
Okay, so DeSoto paints this pretty compelling picture of the problem and the potential solution. But how does this capitalization process actually work in practice? What are the concrete steps involved?
He outlines a multifaceted process, and like you said, it needs to be adapted to each specific context. But some of the key steps he highlights include:
Give us the nitty-gritty.
well, first and foremost, you got to identify and document those existing extra legal arrangements. This means going out into communities, talking to people, understanding how they're actually organizing their lives and their businesses.
It's almost like anthropological fieldwork.
You could say that you need to map out those social contracts, the unwritten rules that govern how people interact, how they resolve disputes, how they establish ownership. Then you got to translate those arrangements into a language that the formal legal system can understand.
So it's like building a Rosetta Stone between the extra-legal and legal worlds.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And this is where things can get tricky. You need to find a way to integrate those extra legal arrangements without undermining their functionality.
Right. You don't want to impose a bunch of regulations that stifle the very dynamism you're trying to harness.
Precisely. And then, of course, you got to find ways to overcome that political resistance we talked about earlier. This might involve building coalitions with reform-minded elites, educating lawyers about the potential benefits of a more inclusive system, and demonstrating to extra-legal entrepreneurs that formalization won't destroy their livelihoods.
Sounds like a massive undertaking requiring a deep understanding of the local context, a willingness to compromise, and a whole lot of patience.
It is. But DeSoto argues that if it's done right, the payoff can be enormous. As more people gain access to the formal economy, they can contribute to economic growth, which in turn creates more opportunities for everyone. It's a virtuous cycle.
And it can help break down those barriers between the haves and the have-nots, leading to a more just and equitable society. It's an inspiring vision, but does it actually work in the real world? Are there examples of DeSoto's ideas being put into practice?
There are, and with varying degrees of success. We'll explore some of those real-world examples and delve into some of the criticisms of DeSoto's work in the next part.
All right, so we've explored DeSoto's argument for unlocking all this dead capital, and it sounds pretty compelling. But I mean, like any bold idea, it's bound to have its share of critics, right? What are some of the pushbacks against his theories?
Yeah, definitely. One of the main criticisms you hear is that DeSoto might be oversimplifying things a bit. You know, the relationship between property rights and economic development. It's not as simple as saying, give everyone formal titles and boom, instant economic miracle.
Right, there's got to be more to it than that.
Exactly. There are so many other factors at play: access to education, healthcare, stable political institutions. You need the whole ecosystem to really make it work.
So property rights might be a key ingredient, but not the whole recipe.
Precisely. It's like having a car but no roads to drive on. You need the whole infrastructure.
That makes sense. What are some other concerns people have raised?
Well, another critique is that DeSoto might be underestimating the potential downsides of formalization. You know, some people worry that by bringing these extra legal businesses into the formal system, you could actually end up stifling their flexibility and innovation.
Because they've had to be so adaptable to survive in that informal world.
Exactly. They've thrived by operating under a very specific set of circumstances, and too much regulation could actually backfire.
It's like taking a wild bird that's used to soaring freely and putting it in a cage. It might be safer, but it can't fly the same way.
That's a great analogy. And then there's the concern that formalization could actually worsen inequality if it's not done carefully. You know, if the process is too cumbersome or expensive, it could end up benefiting those who are already better off and further marginalizing the most vulnerable.
So it's really important to make sure this capitalization process is truly inclusive and accessible to everyone, not just those with resources and connections.
Absolutely. And of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room: corruption. Any system that involves the transfer of property rights is going to be vulnerable to abuse. If you don't have strong safeguards and transparency mechanisms in place, this whole capitalization process could become a tool for the powerful to enrich themselves at the expense of the poor.
That's a really important point. So it sounds like there are some valid concerns about DeSoto's ideas, but have they actually been put into practice anywhere? Are there real-world examples we can learn from?
Yeah, there are, and the results have been kind of mixed. One example that comes to mind is Rwanda. In the early 2000s, they undertook this nationwide land titling program, inspired in part by DeSoto's work.
And how did that turn out?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, the program did lead to increased investment in land and improved access to credit for some, but there were also problems with the accuracy of some of the land records, and concerns were raised that the process didn't adequately protect the rights of women and marginalized communities.
So it's a cautionary tale about the importance of careful planning and implementation.
Exactly. It highlights how complex land reform is and how crucial it is to get it right.
Are there any examples of DeSoto's ideas being implemented successfully?
There are. One notable success story is Peru, where DeSoto's own organization, the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, ILD, has been working for decades to formalize property rights.
And what kind of progress have they made?
They've had a pretty significant impact. Their work has helped streamline the process for registering businesses and property, which has led to a huge reduction in the time and cost involved.
So they've made it easier for people to operate legally and participate in the formal economy.
Exactly. And that's opened up access to financial services and opportunities that were previously out of reach for a lot of people.
So it seems like DeSoto's ideas can work, but it takes a long-term commitment, careful planning, and a deep understanding of the local context. It's not a quick fix.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem of dead capital. But DeSoto's work has given us this really valuable framework for thinking about how to unlock the potential of the world's poor. It's a call to action for policymakers, development experts, and all of us to really think critically about the systems we have in place and find ways to make them more inclusive and just.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about economics, it's about social justice. It's about creating a world where everyone has a chance to thrive, regardless of where they were born or what circumstances they face.
Exactly. And I think that's something worth striving for.
I think you're right. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into Hernando de Soto's The Mystery of Capital. We've explored the problem of dead capital, the potential solutions, the complexities of implementation. We've looked at successful examples and cautionary tales and hopefully sparked some new ideas and perspectives.
And if you want to learn more about DeSoto's work and this whole capitalization process, I highly recommend checking out his book. It's a thought-provoking read that'll definitely challenge your assumptions and expand your understanding of the world.
And who knows? Maybe it'll even inspire you to be part of the solution. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.